Shabbat Shalom. We may be seated for a moment together. So as we mentioned last week, we're going to begin our service this morning by exploring the weekly Parasha reading. Now, the Hebrew term Parasha means an account of something or the telling of something. And in Jewish tradition, we split up the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, into 54 parashas. 54 parashot. And the reason is so that once a week we could read through together, and in a year we read the entire Torah as a community. Now, while this practice may be new for our community here at Beth Ariel, this tradition stretches all the way back to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. It was practiced by Yeshua and his followers in the New Testament, and it's a staple of worship today. The importance of this reading is that it allows us as a community to explore a portion of the text, to reflect on it, and to prepare our hearts for the worship of the one true God. Now, a parasha is a larger unit of scripture. It's about 4 to 6 chapters, so we're not going to do a verse-by-verse analysis in our short little 7 minutes here. Rather, we're going to summarize some of the content and then see what we could draw from it for our spiritual lives this morning. So our parasha this morning, as we could see up on the PowerPoint, stretches from Exodus 13 all the way to 17, and it is entitled B'Shalach. Can you say that with me? B'Shalach. Beautiful. We all speak Hebrew now. B'Shalach. And it means when he sent out. And this refers to when Pharaoh finally sent out the Israelites from slavery in Egypt into freedom. And imagine this answer to prayer that the Israelites were experiencing. You see, up until now, in the biblical story, we're waiting for this freedom. Remember in Genesis, God said to Abraham, your descendants are going to be slaves in a land that is not their own for 400 years. When Exodus opens up, the Israelites are crying out to God, saying, please redeem us. And finally, God raised a redeemer, and they were saved. Now, most of us know the story of Passover. If you don't, we're going to be doing a Passover Seder in about a month and a half, so keep your eyes open for that. But in sum, if you don't make it, God sent 10 plagues over Egypt. And after the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh said, go, get out. And that's where our parasha opens, the B'Shalach, and he let them go. Now for Israel, they saw God move powerfully, right? Their faith was strengthened. They entered into a time of rejoicing. Their trials were over. Just imagine if you were in Egypt and it was time to go, how they went quickly and how you would not look back. Your prayers were now answered. However, what we see in this parasha, B'Shalach, is that when Israel begins their wilderness journey to the promised land, the struggles and the difficulties in life do not go away. Whether it was the threat of warfare, whether it was thirst, whether it was anger, or lack of water, their life was still filled with trials. And what we learn from this is that trials are an unavoidable part of life. And so then the question should be not how do I avoid hard times, how do I avoid trials, but rather how do we grow in them? How do we thrive through them? And what is the purpose of them? And our parasha this morning answers that very question. Unfortunately, as Israel was faced with these trials, they resorted to complaining, to grumbling against their leadership. And we're told the heart condition that they had all the way in Exodus 17. You see, they were asking, is the Lord actually with us or not? To them, trials meant God is not with me anymore. And we could say, how can they do that? How can, after they come out from the Exodus, but how often do we do that as well? In the midst of trials, we say, God, where are you? However, what we see is that trials do not mean that God has left you. Trials are an opportunity for God to show you his power in your life. And that's what we find here. You see, in Exodus, when Israel was walking out of Egypt, when they were finally set free, the B'Shalach, what happened to Pharaoh? His heart grew hard once again. And he got 600 of his chariots, and he said, we're going after Israel, and we're going to slaughter them. So just imagine you're coming out with the Israelites. You are now stuck. You have the Red Sea on one hand. You have Pharaoh's army coming from the other. And you're wondering, what were we freed from? What were we freed for? We went from one trial, slavery, to another trial, sudden death. And the Israelites asked that exact same question. They cried out to Moses, were there not enough graves in Egypt? Did you bring us out here in order to die? Where was God? But it's in the midst of that trial that God showed his power. What happened was that through Moses, they were able to split the sea, and Israel walked through unharmed. See, just as God preserved Noah in the ark from the water, just as he preserved Moses in the basket on the Nile, he preserved Israel with his hand walking through the water, and he showed his great power. And in Exodus 14:31, it says, when Israel saw the great power that the Lord had used, the people feared the Lord, they believed in the Lord, and they believed in his servant Moses. So what's the purpose of trials? Think of them like logs that we put onto our fire, that we put onto our fire of faith. And the more that we put into it, the more we see God's power in our lives, the more our faith grows. So how do we keep our trust in God? You know, I love Scripture because it gives you the good and the bad. And it's a great example for us. What we see with Israel, even in our short parasha, is that a great thing happens, their faith goes up, but if you don't feed the fire, it goes down. That's exactly what happened here. They get to the Red Sea, they're saying, where's God? God showed up, and then their faith had grown. But then right in the next chapter, in chapter 15, there was no water, and they grumbled against Moses. But God showed up, and he gave water. In chapter 16, there was no food, and they grumbled against Moses. God showed up, and he gave manna, and he gave meat. And then in chapter 17, and once again, there was no water, and they grumbled against Moses. So what causes this disturbance of faith, this turbulence, this up and down? Again, we're told they would ask the question, is the Lord among us or not? They doubted what God showed them. They doubted in the dark what God showed them in the light. So for us this morning, how can we stay strong in the midst of trials? How can we keep our faith strong and keep feeding it that wood so that we grow powerfully? The Parasha gives us these very tools, and I'm just going to list 3 here. First, journal. Write down what God does in your life. This is the exact example we're given in this Parasha. When Israel beat the Amalekites in Exodus 17, the Lord instructed Moses, write this in a book of memorial and recite it to Joshua. Why? Because to go forward in faith, we need to remember that we have a God who we could trust. Remember those events. So journal. The second, keep memorials. Keep objects that remind us of who God is in our life. When God provided manna, Moses told Aaron, take a jar of it and put it in the tabernacle. That was a sign that they could always trust God, even when it looked dark and even when it looked scary. So journal, keep memorials, and then the third and final thing is, as a community, sing songs together, reflecting on the greatness of God. What's the first thing that Israel did when they crossed through that Red Sea? They sang the song of Moses, the song of the sea. They sang the song reflecting on God's greatness. And that's why it's so important weekly we come together as a community and we remember the greatness of God. And that continues to put logs of fire in our faith.